So we hope that our work, and hopefully the work that follows, challenge not only the Scottish Government but also the Scottish public. Is aligning their economy so closely and quickly with the European Union the right decision? And what would convergence look like for an independent Scotland's economy if it pivoted towards the European Union? In February 2025, Scotland's First Minister John Swinney said, "I believe that rejoining the EU should be our clearly stated goal and a national mission." Now, Mr Swinney is part of an exceptionally pro-EU Scottish Government administration. Despite differences on other issues, the administration is as Eurocentric as those that came before. Now, since Scotland voted to remain part of the UK in 2014, partly because this was supposed to mean staying in the European Union, there has been an end destination for Scottish independence. For both the Scottish Government and a large part of the population, the desire is to return to the European Union. This position was solidified when 2 years later, Scotland voted 62% to 38% to remain in the Brexit referendum. Now, the feeling is mutual. According to polling in July 2025 by YouGov, European nations would hang out the tartan dishcloths if Scotland were to rejoin the European Union. So this consensus has allowed Darkents and me to ask a straightforward question. What does economic convergence look like for an independent Scotland's economy as it transitions away from life as a currency user as part of the UK and towards membership of the EU? Now, this is a simple and essential question, but one that is incredibly difficult to answer. It's as meaty as a Scotch pie dropped in a beef bourguignon. Now, we have but taken a nibble in our discussion paper that concentrates on the impact of the EU's fiscal rules on a newly independent Scotland before it joins the European Union, because this is the current Scottish Government's plan. We hope our paper sparks an academic process that will encourage others to question the details of this economic plan, as well as excite researchers beyond the economic sphere. It's a fascinating topic for everyone in the social sciences. If or when Scotland becomes independent, how will Scotland cope and adapt with a sharp focus away from the English border towards and across the English Channel? How European is a nation stuck on the periphery of Europe? What cultural renaissance beckons? Will Scotland drift towards the Nordic countries or towards France and Germany? What about its stepping stone role between the US and Europe? How easy is it to end a 300-odd year union and jump into bed with one that's only 50 years old? What impact will this have on other separatist movements in Europe? But let's leave those head scratchers for later and for others to address. The discussion paper Undermining Economic Resilience, the Economic Impact of Adopting the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact in an Independent Scotland addresses only one aspect of that convergence: the desire of an SNP administration, should it still be in power after a yes vote, to unilaterally follow the European Union's fiscal rules, known as the Stability and Growth Pact. To the impartial observer, it appears peculiar that as soon as Scotland leaves the economic union of the United Kingdom, it would volunteer to accept a very similar framework of fiscal rules for an independent Scotland, while not being a member of the EU. Now, first introduced in Europe in the early 1990s, debt and deficit targets changed the rules of the game. They're designed to ensure that governments control their day-to-day spending, a fancy way of saying fiscal austerity. Now, in a recent survey, Swiss researchers Brandl and Elsener found that fiscal rules have the strongest limiting impact on social spending. Well, we think that's mainly because this is what they are designed to do. Many policymakers, as well as a few mainstream economists and policy institutes, are aware that rigidly adhering to fiscal rules in the UK is harming the economy. But that's only half the story. The recent neo-fascist demonstrations across the UK show that as austerity bites, the right-wing stock rises. How easily we've forgotten or ignored that over 300,000 premature deaths were caused by austerity in the UK during Osborne's austerity years in 2010 to 2015. Fiscal targets lead to increased unemployment and below target inflation, as the 2010s have shown in the eurozone. Mass unemployment and rising inequality have led to political instability, which is now playing out in many eurozone member states. Hence the somewhat tongue-in-cheek but more appropriate renaming of the Stability and Growth Pact as the Instability and No Growth Pact. The evidence weighs heavily in favour of this being a more appropriate moniker. Now, there is not much dissent from the statement that austerity doesn't work. Even the IMF's World Economic Outlook in 2023 found that austerity doesn't reduce the level of government debt, which, remember, is the main reason for fiscal rules. So Dirk and I advise you to take a step back. If you were in charge of a newly independent nation that was exiting from the UK, easily the state that has the most deeply embraced fiscal austerity, how high up your list would it be to undergo even harsher austerity? Because even harsher austerity would happen in Scotland if it tried to align with a 3% GDP fiscal target quickly. So you can see Scotland's historic public deficit. It's important to note that this includes all three levels of government: local, subnational, Holyrood, and national at Westminster. The level of public deficit also reflects Scotland's position as part of the United Kingdom. We argue that economic fundamentals are unlikely to change substantially over the first decade of independence, so these figures are a good starting point. The dotted line marks the SGP level of 3%. You can clearly see that Scotland passed the SGP test in only 3 out of 25 years. This enabled us to come to the conclusion that relatively high public deficits appear to be the norm rather than the exception. This means there is little hope that continued on-trend economic growth in the Scottish economy would be compatible with the Stability and Growth Pact. The Scottish public deficit on average since 2010 is around 12%. Now, as modern monetary theorist economists, both Dirk and I would make a very separate argument that this level of public deficit is not an issue. But that isn't the point of this video or our report. We are dealing exclusively with the impact of moving from close to 12% to below 3%. Fiscal rules would lead to crushing austerity in an independent Scotland. So using a relatively simple macroeconomic model, but basing all variables on real data with realistic parameters, we decided to consider how much pain would be felt if a newly independent Scotland did, in fact, switch to following the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, using the best case scenario of 1.4% of GDP, which is the average growth rate for Scotland from 2000 to 2019, we calculated 4 pathways. We assume independence arrives this year. The actual date doesn't matter. It's the duration and the level of pain that makes a difference. There would be significant government spending cuts, fiscal austerity from the first year of independence under all 4 pathways. Pathways 1 and 2 are clearly politically unachievable. For example, Pathway 2's 7.5% reduction in government spending, much less severe than Scenario 1, is an unfathomable drop. This level of reduction is roughly equivalent to what was implemented in Greece, starting with the austerity measures imposed by the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund in 2010. And this has had a crushing impact on the Greek economy. According to the World Bank, Greece's 2024 GDP was 77% of its 2008 level. The unemployment rate right now in Greece is almost double what it is in Scotland. Now, stretching the adjustment for the Scottish economy over a decade or more makes the pain only a little more palatable. Even in the best pathway, the deficit limit would not be achieved for 15 years and would mirror the UK's austerity that between 2010 and 2015 resulted in real term cuts of 2% in total public spending. Those cuts caused significant and lasting damage to services and communities, and the period is derided by both the public in Scotland and its policymakers. So this means we can ask the question, what does economic independence mean under this plan? The Scottish Government argues that independence will allow Scotland to tailor policy to Scotland's needs, build greater equality and wellbeing, and become more resilient. Now, we fully agree, this is a fundamental case for independence. However, adopting the Stability and Growth Pact, a poorly designed, counterproductive and rigid fiscal framework intended explicitly for the eurozone, directly contradicts that goal. It's not tailoring policy to Scotland's needs, it's outsourcing the rules of the game to a framework built for entirely different economic and political reasons. So we hope that our work, and hopefully the work that follows, challenge not only the Scottish Government but also the Scottish public. Is aligning their economy so closely and quickly with the European Union the right decision? In 1992, Wynne Godley questioned the economic impact of European integration in his famous article Maastricht and All That. To paraphrase the opening sentence, many people throughout Scotland are largely unaware of the impact of joining the EU. Maybe when they are aware of the impact, the mission may change, perhaps it won't. However, if the goal is to make the case for a more prosperous future as an independent nation, then it's surely essential to question and analyse the implications of converging with the EU. You can download Undermining Economic Resilience, the economic impact of adopting the European Union Stability and Growth Pact in an independent Scotland from the link in the show notes.